All right, it's such a pleasure to be back in Durham for Conj and to be finishing the day with so many friends, old and new. And I want to start by talking about a 2015 book by Adam Tornhill, Your Code as a Crime Scene. And he says that criminal investigators ask many of the same open-ended questions that programmers ask while they're working through a code base. And this is spot on, and I would take it a step further and say that, in fact, Sherlock Holmes is the OG software developer. And this talk is going to be making this point starting with the obligatory definition slide. So today's definition is the canon. The canon is the 56 short stories and 4 novels about Sherlock Holmes that were written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. There's a lot of other stuff about Sherlock Holmes. How many people have seen a movie with Sherlock Holmes in it? Or a TV show with Sherlock Holmes in it? So we're not going to be talking about those today. We're going to be talking about the books. And we're talking about what we can learn from Sherlock Holmes about how we do software development and how we could do it better. Throughout the talk, I'm going to be quoting from the canon. And all the slides that quote from the canon look the same for your easy reference. They have a quote in big font in the middle of the slide, and at the bottom is the name of the story in a font so small that you can't read it and therefore have no way to actually fact-check me. However, after the talk today, I will post the slides online, so if you want to go back and read the original stories behind these ideas, you'll be able to do so. And you can see this quote from The Adventure of the Copper Beeches. Crime is common, logic is rare. That sounds almost like something you could hear said in a software meeting or a stand-up or a retrospective. People are mostly criminals and programs are mostly bad. So I want to start with problem solving. Programming is problem solving, and this is an idea that Rich has done a great job of communicating to us in the Clojure ecosystem. And so it's a regular idea, and I've actually seen this. This happens at Cognitech, that happens on the product team with Atomic, but I've seen this percolate through in other companies. So I've been in meetings at other companies where someone starts to do something very movie software-ish, like whipping out a keyboard, and someone else just puts a hand on their shoulder and says, "Whoa there, what's the problem statement?" And the thing about it is that it's an easy idea, but it's tough to master. So how does one, I can say, you shouldn't proceed without a good problem statement, but how does one go about getting one? And the way Holmes approaches it is iteratively. One of the things that Sherlock Holmes does is insist on having other people verbalize multiple times the information that he's going to use to come up with a problem statement. So he says in The Stockbroker's Clerk, "Please tell me the succession of events again." And in The Adventure of Black Peter, he says, "I would be none the worse if I could hear that sequence of events one more time." Every once in a while, he even bestirs himself to state the events for somebody else to listen to a second time. And he clearly is the father of pair programming and cardboard cutout programming. It says, "You know what? I don't understand this right now, so I'm going to say it to you, Watson. And by the time I'm done saying it, I'll have gained at least some measure of additional insight." So, great. Holmes and Watson invented pair programming, and all you have to do to be a good software developer is find a friend, get a cool Victorian wardrobe, optional goofy mustache, and boom. The problem, though, is that most problem statements are bad. And they're bad in particular ways. And so getting a problem statement right is an iterative process for most people. Now, Rich is particularly good at this. So if you play this game with him, he has this skill, which is not talking until he's done his thinking, which is really unfair, because I'm totally the opposite. I definitely talk by way of thinking, and I say progressively less stupid things until I get to something somewhat reasonable. But Rich has this trick where he just sits there and the look says, those things you other people are saying seem kind of stupid. And then eventually he'll be like, okay, here's the problem. But you actually see this process play out. Rich is not the original here. Sherlock Holmes is the original. You see this process play out in the stories. And one of the important things that you want to do is separate, usually, bad problem statements are complected. I was going to say, everybody has to drink right now, so. That's water, by the way. Yeah, water. Yeah, you can do what you want. I'm still on the clock. So what Holmes does is takes apart problem statements that seem like simple statements but are actually compounds. And sometimes that's about teasing apart assumptions. So there were no footmarks. Oh, meaning that you saw no footmarks. So he's taken what seemed like an idea and broken it into two ideas, which is that there was somebody looking for footmarks and they failed to find any, is an entirely different point than there were no footmarks. And this is incredibly important because when we are making problem statements, we often bake in the analysis of the problem, not the problem itself. So we say something that combines what the problem is with our beginning analysis of the problem, or our presumptions, or worst of all, we bake in common sense, which is a terrible enemy of doing good work. And a great example of this is in the story The Reigate Squires, where a policeman says to Holmes, how can we get at the criminal's pocket before we catch the criminal? And the way they actually catch the criminal in this story is that Holmes says, you know what? We don't have the criminal and we don't know who the criminal is. But if we had the criminal's pocket, we would have the information we need to capture the criminal. Now, everybody else is not capable of using that as a problem statement because their common sense cuts in. And what does your common sense tell you in that situation? If I don't know who the criminal is and I don't have the criminal, there's no possible way I could have the criminal's pocket. But Holmes teases those things apart, and once he does that, it turns out that there is a way in the story, and you can go read it, to acquire this criminal's pocket without acquiring the criminal, which is what they go about doing. And so it's an iterative exercise, and you need to tease apart the problem from your assumptions. So the first trick to being a good software developer is to state the problem. That's probably unremarkable in a closure room. Now, the second important thing is that you need tools. You need lots of tools. They need to be super shiny. You need IDEs and build tools and debuggers and frameworks. That's what we all do around here, tool-driven development. Well, and this is in fact supported a little bit in the canon to this extent. Holmes is a tool user, and he's a very good tool user. And in fact, and I didn't know this until I was researching the talk, that Holmes is the first character in fiction to use the magnifying glass as an investigative tool. So, but that being said, the magnifying glass kind of gives you a little bit of insight into the sorts of tools that Holmes goes for. He's not looking for something big or fancy or shiny or complicated or enterprisey. He's looking for something lean and general purpose. And so even though Holmes does use tools, and he uses other tools as well, the things that stands out about him is not that he has more or better tools than the police, but that he has a small set of tools and he uses them extremely well. And his best tool is in fact his eyes. And so there's, story after story, poor Watson will say, you seem to have seen something I didn't see. And Holmes will say, well, we both looked at the same thing, right? But I did in fact deduce a little bit more. Or problems may be solved in the study that have baffled those who sought a solution by the aid of their senses. So Holmes would rather sit and think before even pulling out a tool to begin with. And then the tool set is the least important part. Algorithms are fairly simple, and that simplicity is a strength. Okay, that's actually not a quote from the canon. That's actually back to the Adam Thornhill book. So, but it is in fact the same idea. So the second point that I would make is use simple tools. And I don't need to elaborate on this because there are entire talks in the closure world about simplicity, but I would make the point that these tools are likely to be small relative to the power that they deliver. They're likely to be general purpose and to work in a generic way with data. Now, the next piece of advice I'm going to give you is proved controversial with test audiences. The third thing you need to do to be a good software developer is smoke. And unfortunately, when I say smoke, I don't mean smoke a little bit or smoke once or don't inhale. I actually mean smoke a lot. So when you have a problem, you need to smoke several pipes. Cigarettes are okay too, but pipes are good. And this is the kind of thing that you could do all day, right? You could. So without further ado, or explanation, or justification, I'm just going to say that you need to smoke a lot. Now, happily, for the most part, Rich is a shifty character who's just trading on Sherlock Holmes' fame in building closure and Datomic and things like that. But this is an area where Rich actually provided a healthful innovation, which is instead of smoking, you can use Hammock Time. So Hammock Time is a non-cancer causing substitute for smoking, but it actually accomplishes the same purposes, right? It gives you the opportunity to let the stuff that you've loaded into your background mind percolate and develop ideas. And once you realize that smoking was the one that Holmes liked and that Hammock Time is the one that Hickey liked, one thing you might conclude is that your name actually has to start with H to be good at this game, which is why Halloway actually prefers trail run driven development. So the thing that really works for me is going out on a trail and taking a 3-mile run or a 5-mile run. I wish my legs would let me do longer than that because it's actually where the work gets done. So as I become more aerobically fit, I write better software, which is sort of a win-win. But the idea is to give your mind the freedom to work. And Rich has given an entire talk about this, hammock-driven development. The one point I would bring up from that talk to remind you of here, because Holmes thinks about it a lot, is that when you're doing this work, you need to consider multiple alternatives. One of the things that vanishes in implementation and in a lot of architecture diagrams and other kinds of artifacts and documentation is the consideration of alternatives. And when you have a theory about a crime, you need to have your second best theory, and you need to know why your first best theory is better than your second best theory. When you have a plan for software that you're going to build, you need to have a plan that says, if I were forbidden to use this plan, what would my next plan be? And what would its characteristics be? And why do I like my first best plan better? So, but just as a code word for these ideas, just remember, smoke a lot. Whether your problem is a crime or a program, your reasoning must account for everything. In particular, the word that Holmes likes to use is trifles. You must account for trifles that initially seem unconnected to the problem. And when you're reading the Holmes stories, the word trifle is a literary tip that Holmes is about to outperform everybody else. Whenever a witness says, well, I almost didn't think this was worth mentioning because it can't possibly be related to the case. It was just too trivial. You can rest assured that that is going to be a linchpin in actually solving the problem. And Holmes says it again and again. There's nothing so important as trifles. You know my method. It is founded upon the observation of trifles. And does your explanation cover every point? This is a thing that software developers mess up over and over again. You have 10 pieces of information at your fingertips about a problem, and you have a theory that is supported by 9 of those pieces of information, but outright contradicted by the 10th piece of information, which admittedly is the least important, most minor detail of all that information. So, choice A, you're like, well, hey, 90%, that's a B plus or an A minus. We should just proceed forward. Or choice B, you have to think longer. And in my work in support, I can tell you that anybody who's ever worked in support, what do people do? They're like, well, there was a problem. and I didn't know what was going on, so I did stuff. So the fourth thing to remember is account for details. You have to account for all the trifles, and it's often the case that our biases have us want to look at the information that's most exciting, that's most emotionally charged, right? The pool of blood on the floor is a lot more interesting than the little trail of dust on the windowsill. But when you're doing problem solving, it's not about the thing that's biggest. It's about how the things all relate together, and they all have to work. They can't mostly work. So this is great, but there's a problem. You can make your problem statements. You can have good tools. You can use them carefully. You can smoke a lot, and you can count for all the trifles. But deep down, where you don't want to look, you're just afraid that Sherlock Holmes is smarter than you are, and that the actual reason that Sherlock Holmes can solve these cases and the actual reason that the top performing developers can write software is they have an enormous mind palace that you simply don't have. And it's a gift from nature that you cannot get. And the canon supports this idea. Holmes has things that in individual citation don't seem like superpowers when you start listing them. So here's one. I can distinguish at a glance the ash of any brand of cigar or tobacco. And in a culture where everybody's smoking, this is pretty useful in identifying crimes. Or it would be a poor expert who could not give the date of a document. And by this, the power I'm describing is I could look out into the room and tell how old pieces of paper were that were in your hands. That one's 15 years old. That one's 35 years old. Or my personal favorite, Sherlock Holmes was the world's leading expert in his time in a little-known field, trouser splash geolocation. And so the way this works is you look at somebody's trousers from across the room, and you have a complete Google Maps story in your head of where they've been. And the stories enumerate these unusual skills again and again. And so the bottom line is there are a few people who are superhuman, and they're gifted, and they can do this stuff, and the rest of us can't. But that's not where the canon stops. And in fact, mind palace is probably the most insidious phrase to work its way into pop culture from the Sherlock Holmes stories, because that is not what Sherlock Holmes calls his head. He calls it a little brain attic. A little teeny weeny brain attic. And the point that Holmes makes about his brain attic when he's asked, not only it's not large, it's small, but his superpower is in not putting things in there. His superpower is not in putting things in there. It is avoiding putting things in there. It is avoiding exposure to information that will waste the very tiny space in his mind palace. This is the Victorian equivalent of stay off Facebook and Fox News. But in fact, it goes further than that. Not only does he avoid exposing himself to information that's not going to help him solve crimes, he even avoids perfectly useful information that might be distracting. At one point, Watson finds out that Holmes does not know if the earth goes around the sun or if the sun goes around the earth. And he's appalled because all smart Victorians, of course, know the facts of this case. And Holmes says, not only do I not know that, I'm going to endeavor to forget it. Right? Because he does not foresee that that's going to be useful in solving crimes. Now, okay, so he has a tiny mind attic, not an enormous mind palace. And he has chosen to furnish it with the things that are important for his job. That's a good lesson. But the other thing that he does, and I think that it's quite clear in the canon, but a little bit hard to see in TV and movies, is he writes things down. Holmes is an inveterate logger and keeper of information. He maintains an index of every past case. He will not talk about cases that are not the current case unless he is first given time to go and read the index and ponder it and reload the context. Anybody who has had to work on software that they wrote 3 years ago knows exactly what we're talking about here. So he's constantly suggesting, not I have encyclopedic memory of every case that I've ever worked on, but I have written things down. Holmes likes to draw maps, and he likes to use maps, and he likes to take notes while he's interviewing witnesses and suspects. And perhaps the best single indicator of Holmes as a normal person accomplishing extraordinary things comes in The Adventure of the Dancing Men, when he has to cryptanalyze the messages of the dancing men. If Holmes were the kind of savant that we can't approach, he would stare at these dancing men, and there would be some weird camera effects and some cool soundtrack music by a hip composer, after which the answer would just appear to him. But that is not at all what happens in the story. What Holmes actually does is what you or I or anybody else might do. He sits for hours and fills a wastebasket with scrap paper as he works out on paper the frequency analysis. I'm going to start by guessing the most common character is E and see where that takes me. And then I'm going to start, go down this road. He does what an ordinary person who is careful and methodical would do. So Holmes is not at all Rain Man. And in fact, the character in fiction or in TV and movies that he most reminds me of is the T-800. He maintains detailed files. Maintaining detailed files is not a savant-like superpower. You can do that too. So my fifth piece of advice to you is to write things down. It is stunning to me. I know this sounds trite, and I get up, once a year in front of an overlapping group of people and keep telling people to write things down. When you don't write things down, you're basically saying, I can outperform other people who are writing things down while juggling chainsaws in my head. And developers do this all the time. They wrestle with problems and they don't just write things down. So I cannot underscore this point enough. Now, you've stated a problem. You've iterated on it. You've used your universal toolkit to collect some information. You have arisen from your hammock, empowered with new ideas. You've written down a careful plan, including multiple alternatives. Now it's time to kick some ass. And this, in fact, is a thing that Holmes does, and it's totally supported in the canon. He's a decent shot with a pistol and a rifle, although that is not something that comes up that often because Watson is a crack shot, so Watson usually gets that job. But he's also a very good stick fighter and boxer. And not only is he good at those things, he positively enjoys them. He is flushed with delight as he tells Watson how he beat the crap out of a ruffian. And so, what are we to make of this? Well, first off, yay, that's cool. Action movie time. I think the modern analog to this might be Amazon's bias for action. I'm not sure if any of you have ever interviewed for a job at Amazon, but one of the things that Amazon tells you, they actually have a website, you can go read this, is speed matters in business. Decisions and actions are reversible. We do not need a lot of study. We need action. Action, action, action. Gunshots, stick fights, beating up ruffians. This is a terrible idea. Amazon is completely wrong about this, which is why Jeff Bezos is where he is and where I am. He just got lucky. He's still wrong. Act a little less, think a little more. Holmes swings into action, but he thinks first. He sifts the details. And in fact, Holmes stops working entirely when he doesn't have good information. When he doesn't have good information, he puts it on the shelf. Alex Miller, I'm sure, remembers how long the ideas that became spec sat on the shelf in people's heads until they came together as something that actually became code. It was a period of years. Holmes says, you know what, we're going to put the problem on the shelf, and he goes and does something fun. He says, I don't have what I need to solve this problem right now. And Watson, in fact, calls attention to this quite explicitly. He says, Sherlock Holmes just puts his brain into neutral and goes and does something fun when he doesn't have the information he needs to move forward. Conversely, who in the Holmes stories has a bias for action? It's not Holmes. It's poor Lestrade, right? Lestrade is always moping about all his different fictional incarnations, swinging into action. And Holmes characterizes that action as a herd of buffalo wallowing all over the evidence and ruining it. So yes, you are going to act. Eventually, if you're writing software, some fraction of the time, you're going to be presented with a problem and say, you know what? This problem actually could benefit from some software that doesn't exist, that I know how to write. But when it comes time, act with precision. So that's it. If you want to code like Holmes, come up with a good problem statement, prefer simple tools, smoke a lot, account for trifles, write things down, and act with precision. Awesome. It's possible, though, that something about this combination of things leads you to be a very oddball person. And the movies certainly give Holmes a comically manic personality. He pursues both criminal cases and his other avocations with feverish energy. And the canon supports this. When Holmes is working on a case, he does things like forget to eat breakfast. He does things like work 15 hours a day for 5 days at a stretch. That's what we in the Agile community call a sprint. But that is only part of the story. Holmes activates like that when he knows there's a moment in time when you have to move quickly because the facts and the criminals are getting away. And then, when that's not the time, he chills. And he says, you know what? I think we should have a whiskey and soda. This interrogating this witness has gotten me kind of tired. Or, we're going to have to go out and catch the bad guys tonight. We should just sit around and smoke. There's the smoking again. And just turn our minds to something more cheerful. Or, bird watching. Not the Holmes you think of if you're watching the movies. We're going to stop in the middle of the case. We're going to do a little bird watching and take a hike. So in addition to all these other things, you need to enjoy your life. It's fine to work hard part of the time, but then you should play hard, and then you should chill the F out. Go outdoors. Be still. Be quiet. The other thing, besides the workaholic idea that is associated with Holmes, is that both he and Mycroft are lacking in people skills. Now, if you remember, this is actually Mycroft, not Sherlock, but it was the best picture. This is a scene from one of the movies that underscores the fact that the Holmes brothers are not entirely aware of what is appropriate attire. And so there's an idea, and of course this goes with the whole savant genius thing, right? You're really good at something, then you must also have a low social IQ, right? You spent all of your it's like a role-playing game. You spent all of your resource allocation points on being incredibly awesome at this one skill, and you had nothing left over for social IQ. And you see that in the canon. Watson complains that Holmes is not patient with dummies. When people have dumb ideas, he is not patient at all. And Holmes says mean things to people when they have dumb ideas. I'm so disappointed in Stanley Hopkins. I had hoped for better things from him. One should look for a possible alternative and provide against it. Now, actually, in Holmes' defense, he didn't say that to Hopkins' face. So he was actually complaining privately to Watson, which shows social IQ, right? He's not venting to the person he's upset with. He's actually turning to Watson and saying that in a sidebar. That would make you feel better until you see what he actually said to Stanley Hopkins' face, which is, I understand, however, that there were some objects which you failed to overlook, which you scratch your head for a second and then realize that you're being insulted. But there's an important point here, which is that Holmes, when he's demonstrating low social IQ, if you want to call it that, 100% of the time, as far as I can tell in the stories, his anger is directed at poor work and incompetence by other people who are doing the job he's doing. Other people who are trying and not doing a very good job and causing people to come to harm because they're not tracking down crimes. Holmes has a perfectly high social IQ when he's talking to victims or witnesses. And so you see Watson saying things like, Holmes welcomed her with easy courtesy, or he sat down on the couch and patted him kindly on the shoulder, or even he is a past master in the art of putting the witness at ease. So now, here I think we should part ways with Holmes. I think it's okay to be nice to your coworkers as well as your stakeholders. But the point that I want to make is that Holmes has a social IQ. He has a set of social skills, and he knows he's making choices about when to use them. All the other things that have to do with being an excellent detective or an excellent programmer are really orthogonal to these social skills. And so you could, as Holmes does to victims and even to criminals, you could be nice, and you should be nice. Since this is a software conference, you are probably wondering, what is Sherlock's favorite language for programming? And I think it's pretty clear that Holmes spent a lot of his time laying groundwork for the closure ecosystem. That all of the ideas that I've stated today about problems and simple tools and Hammock Time and trifles and writing things down and work-life balance, all of these things are ideas that have traction in the closure community because we as a group have worked hard to make that the case. And so I would like to be the first to welcome Sherlock Holmes into our community as the OG closurian. That said, you're probably wondering what his favorite database is. Well, we have less evidence about this, but he has a horror of destroying documents, especially those that were connected with past cases. So it's pretty clear that Holmes would only have ever worked with an immutable database that kept a log and then provided an index where you could get back to your information. So, you don't have to be a genius or a jerk or work 15-hour days in solitude to be a good programmer or a great programmer. But you should have an objective, know what you're doing, say it out loud, have a plan, find a problem that you care about and work on it. You should seek simplicity in your tools and in your approach to the problem. You should take nicotine time or hammock time or run in the woods time or whatever works for you. You should master the trifles. Good design has to account for all the pieces, not just some of the pieces. You should write things down, and when you've done all those things and you choose to act, you should act with precision. And you should balance that with enjoying your life and being nice. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.